I'd like to welcome you to this, I think it's the third in this series of peer webinars brought to you from the Chronic Pain Network. Today's is focusing on engaging with Indigenous health research, or engaging with First Nations communities in the conduct of Indigenous health research. My name is Norm Buckley. I'm the nominated principal investigator for the Chronic Pain Network, and I'm very pleased to introduce Margot Latimer and John Sylliboy. When we were putting together our submission to create this network, Patricia Poulin, who had been at the same time developing a nationwide discussion around pain research priorities, asked me to sit in on a meeting she was having with Indigenous health researchers, community members, knowledge holders, and elders across the country to discuss the interest that that group had in what we were proposing to do for the network. And we were convinced at that point that one of the things we had to do when we established the network was to create an advisory committee for the network. So we did that. The IREC, or the Indigenous Health Research Advisory Committee, became part of our governance. And we've been very pleased to work with them. And two of the leaders of that committee are going to be presenting today's webinar. So I'd like to introduce Margot Latimer, who is a professor of nursing at Dalhousie University. And in fact, she holds a Nova Scotia chair in Indigenous health research and nursing. As an appointment at the IWK, the Isaac Walton Killam Pediatric Health Center in Nova Scotia, and has been conducting the ACHH project, the Aboriginal Children's Hurt and Healing Initiative, working closely with the Eskasoni Health Director, Sharon Rudderham, and she's also one of our principal applicants for this network. And her colleague, John Sylliboy, is a Mi'kmaq from the Eskasoni Millbrook First Nation in Nova Scotia. And he's also the interim executive director of the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance. He's in the course of completing his own doctoral studies, having done his Bachelor of International Relations in Costa Rica and his Master's in Education at Mount St. Vincent. And he's doing his doctoral work in educational studies at McGill University. And I'm now going to let Margot and John take over, but thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your attention, and looking forward to today's webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Norm. We're thrilled to be here today to be sharing this knowledge. And John and I are coming, oh, I guess you have to change the slides, Kim. John and I are coming from Mi'kmaq territory. We're in the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people here in Nova Scotia, actually in Halifax, which is Jabuktuk. On the upper left of your screen is the IWK Health Center, where our research is hosted. I guess it's our research offices. And below there, you'll see the Mi'kmaq flag at Dalhousie University, also where we're affiliated, and then the Mi'kmaq territory map on the right. Next slide, thank you. So as Norm said, we're part of the Chronic Pain Network, which is a pan-Canadian collaboration of patients, researchers, health professionals, educators, and others. And the vision of the network is to change the way pain is managed in Canada, and also reduce pain and improve function and quality of life for those affected, including Indigenous people. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick organizational chart of where we fit within the network. The Indigenous Health Research Advisory Committee is one of the 5 committees of the network. Next slide, please. And so we've been really fortunate, John and I, to be part of 2 pieces of the network. So our Aboriginal Children's Hurt and Healing Initiative, or ACHH, is the acronym for that project, was funded through the network, and we're also part of the IRAC committee. And so when we first began the work with the network, we didn't realize, I guess, the beautiful synergy that would occur as a result of being part of both of those pieces, and how that's come together in what we're going to share with you today. Next. So the Indigenous Health Research Advisory Committee was initially struck to create a library or repository of practical resources for community members who wanted to know more about research process and to be able to work with researchers, as well as for researchers who wanted to learn more about engaging community. So we realized through our work with ACHH, John and I frequently get asked, how are you doing this work? We need more sort of knowledge and hands-on information about how you do that. So as we know, every nation has their own way of doing research and their own engagement protocols and research protocols. So we thought it would be helpful to create a sort of a library of that for people to be able to access. Next. So this is an image of a picture of some of the members of our committee. As I said, it's a working group of CPN, and it's comprised of community members, elders, patients, clinicians, and health researchers, and really coming together from across the country to try and put our heads around how to make this information available. So some of the work of our advisory committee, as I said, is creating this database, and we'll provide the link to that, but we also have a little video we're going to show you just a little bit later in the presentation. It provides us with information around resources, as I said, from communities, community-specific protocols, national protocols, and information about how to use the database. We've also conducted a survey of Chronic Pain Network members. It was sent out to 316 members with 46 people responding. Next slide, please. So these are just a high-level view of some of the responses to that survey. We wanted to get a sense of people's experience with conducting research with Indigenous people. And so as you can see around learning, there is a high degree of interest from the participants to learn about conducting Indigenous health research. And also a high degree of belief that Indigenous people would benefit from being involved in the participants' research. So for example, for people who conduct fibromyalgia research. There's also high interest in learning how to conduct the research. But down in the left-hand corner, the 16% indicated that they had, only 16% indicated that they had experience working in this area. So thus the brief webinar today to kind of get people thinking about it, but also to provide you with some tangible resources to do that. Next slide. So now I'm going to hand this over to John, and so he can provide you with an overview of how we integrated our ACHH initiative and also came up with some considerations to think about.
Thanks, Margot. Go ahead and up tuk. Lucy John Ara, whatever Ming Magi. I just wanted to invite folks to think about the slides back a little bit and acknowledge where you're at. So I always say when you're acknowledging where you're at and trying to understand the importance of acknowledging your connection to where you're at with Indigenous folks, it's to think about you have to image where you're at with the land, with the water, with the folks that are there, with the species and everything that's around us. So that's very important. So this project really is in representation of communities' response to how we do research. It's not by accident that we've been working with our communities here in the Atlantic region and then expanded across Canada. That through community engagement and learning specifically how to do and conduct research respectfully and meaningfully from an Indigenous perspective, or from, let's say in this case, a Mi'kmaq perspective, for example. We're just highlighting one area, but we're learning other perspectives as we go along, but they're very Indigenous and very similar in Indigenous perspectives, but not necessarily to say that they're exactly the same. We can't generalize in that sense. But the idea is that the communities taking the lead on this research has provided us with invaluable information, knowledge, and resources to share the knowledge from the community through us as stewards or messengers, and then we just share it out there with other folks like colleagues and what have you. And one of the things we've also learned is that we can't do it without the community lead doing this process and making sure that the two-eyed seeing approach in what we're founding ourselves and guiding ourselves with is optimal. And we have to make sure that in doing so, we have to go back and forth quite often in how we do that community lead, because I may represent the community, but that doesn't mean I am the decision-making person for this community. So that's important when we do research, for example, and there's a lot of pressure sometimes on Indigenous researchers to try to, represent the whole community or the nation in this case, in my case. And I certainly don't. I always go back to our leadership. I always go back to our elders, and we always go back to our community. That's very important that we do that. So as we move forward, next slide, please. The Aboriginal Children's Hurt and Healing Initiative is the platform that we've been building this knowledge from the community. The community has the knowledge. We've been using the ACHH platform to make sure that we mobilize this knowledge, community knowledge, so that other folks can replicate or continue or even enhance the how-to process of understanding, for example, Indigenous perspectives in health. And in this case, to understand pain and hurt. So that's one part to it. We also understand that the whole principle of this information and knowledge is from the community. So we have permission to share this, but we've always understood that the ownership and control is by our partners who are on this process with us. So we have their consent. Going forward. So the question we go back to again with experience is, where would you go to learn about how to conduct Indigenous health research? And that's the thing. There's many ways of doing this. And in Western-based perspectives, we always go to journals. We always go to different areas. So where would you go to learn about conducting Indigenous health research? And you have research journals, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Google, no idea, other, not applicable. And so some of the answers that we have here. And that'll answer itself, I think. This is an invitation as well for us to reflect on what we know and how we can enhance that knowledge a little bit, so that we apply it into our understanding, for example, of what is the definition of pain. Or if you're not in pain research or in that area, you could apply to your content area, what it is your research focus is. And if not around pain and your content area, we also ask you to define what health is, for example. How, the decolonizing your research is really decolonizing yourself a little bit, and about the perspectives that you may have around Indigenous health research, and even around research altogether. So the question really is about understanding where our influences come. But in this case, when we're doing Indigenous health research, we invite folks to make sure that we take those and we have those on the side, but we need to open up our scope a little bit to understand more from a community perspective where we're going with this. So these are some of the answers. Sorry, yes, go ahead, Margot.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of chirp in there to say also that through our work with the ACHH initiative, we've heard overwhelmingly from communities that pain is within all of these 4 dimensions. And as you can see from the definition, though, that on the previous slide, that spiritual pain isn't included in it. So as researchers, when you think about the validity of your research and how your concept is actually measured, if it's not fully recognized within the worldview definition, then we're not likely to be going to be accurately measuring it or treating it.
That, with this slide, for example, we were discussing this yesterday, how folks often, based their knowledge on what's dictated in public journals by association of experts that say this is the knowledge that's out there. But there's a whole series of knowledge that's not published. There's a whole series of knowledge that's not available on journals in journals or in public domain, for example, that you see with the Canadian Pain Association or any other, pain perspective that may be published, or in a clinical perspective. What we see and what we're learning is that there's a whole other area that needs to be explored. And we often see the physical side and even the mental side of pain. The least amount of knowledge that people are exploring is the emotional and spiritual side. And spiritual side seems to be, people are looking at it as a very mystical area. And they're trying to look at it from a, what does spiritual side mean? Elder Albert Marshall always says that if we have spiritual, starvation, that we can address physical starvation. If we're dehydrated, we give water. If you're hungry, you give food. What happens when you're starving from spiritual health? You can't just nurture it by water or by food. There's a whole other dimension of that knowledge, and all of them are very interconnected with each other. So that goes towards the spiritual side of pain understandings. And there's so much more to share. So, when you're a trainee or when you're a researcher just starting out, then you have to really explore and trust your partners so that, they're leading you along to make sure that they explain those dimensions of knowledge that need to be explained about our health, about our pain understandings or hurt, for example, going on. So our work, as I said, has been community-based. We can't move forward. There is absolutely no way we would go into a community without any indication of the community taking the lead on this. It doesn't even come into my way of thinking that we would do that kind of research, especially doing anything that has what a lot of folks try to look at as deficit-based health perspectives, such as pain, whereas folks may understand it very differently. We've learned also from Elder Albert saying that, the dimensions of pain are part of healing. And so we're learning all these things that are, invaluable knowledge that we want researchers and trainees and clinicians to understand. This is basic knowledge. So we have it. I'm not sure if we can open this video that's there.
We can't do this one.
Okay, let's just continue. So the 8 considerations that we've been looking at through our engagement across for many years. I think the first part of the research started out back in 2008 or 9 in one community, and then it expanded to 4 more communities, first to do the pain and hurt study, and then it added 5 more communities within the same area, and then it grew. By the time we got to SPORE and the Chronic Pain Network, we expanded again, and it keeps growing, and it grows in a very a gradual way. It's evolving as we move forward. But the principles that guide us in this research process are, we looked at all of the protocols that may exist across Canada. We looked throughout, regional representations and what knowledge says around, let's say, Mohawk territory, Anishinaabe territory, or other territories. What do they have that would guide us along as well? But the IRAC, for example, Indigenous Health Research Advisory Committee, also was our very important link to make those points known as we move across Canada to understand that. And it's been a long, very, I don't want to say long as in, oh, this is so long. I'm saying it's been a long, healthy process. And we didn't, pull out these 8 considerations from any public source. We based it on the experiences that we've had here, plus some of the experiences that our communities are saying. So we have community engagement, which is all about relationship building. We have community protocols and ethics. We have capacity development, which is about reciprocity. Indigenous research by design, data considerations, protection and pathways, data interpretation, community knowledge and validation and gardening, and making sure that we continue forward. Now, I'm not sure, Margot, what were we explaining these now or in a bit?
Yeah, just keep moving forward with
Yeah.
each of them.
All right, but before I do that, could I just take a pause? We're at the 25-minute mark, and invite folks, if you have a question in reference to anything that we've said so far, that we can quickly answer, or if you don't mind waiting till the end. Does anyone have a question? All right, so you can also put it in the chat box, and Dawn will help us manage that process as we move forward. So, oh, there I am, present day. Go ahead, move forward. As I was saying, this map shows where this knowledge has been evolving and being anchored on. We've moved around the country and spoke to many people across the regions in many territories and many perspectives as we go along. Very similarly, a lot of folks are saying it's always got to be Indigenous led. It's got to be partnered in a meaningful and respectful way. It's got to be led by the community. We have to follow the OCAP principles. We have to follow the recommendations that are outlined by the CIHR Chapter 9 guidelines, for example. All of those are very established principles. But at the same time, we're collecting all these other pieces of knowledge that overlap with some of the knowledge that we've already had because of the research that's been done here in Mi'kma'ki, and also with other areas. And it's incredible how much information people know out there, but we rely on you know, that partnership, that strength and that kinship that you may have with our partners, so that you know, we collect that knowledge and then use it according to their need. It's principally that way, right? And so you'll see across to Canada these places where we have had contact with folks. We didn't go to Northern Labrador, but we had been engaging with Northern Labrador, for example, throughout this time. But the other folks where we see on the, you know, the southern part of Canada, we've been going back and forth with a lot of folks and meeting and learning and continue to learn. Next slide. So the questions you have to consider in doing Indigenous health research from anywhere across Canada, and this is relatable to all of the information that we've gathered across the regions. You must answer the following questions. Is it a priority to the community? How will it benefit the community? And could we continue to be a part of a solution in addressing the health issues after the research part is completed? When you go into relationship, not just partnership and not just you know, research partnership, you're going into a relationship with the community and relying on their guidance and trusting their guides to make sure that we get it right. So that relationship building process is immensely important. This is where you know and will learn about the protocols of the community, how it's, you know, how the community engages with, for example, folks to, to recruit researchers, for example, in the community. How we can support any of the processes in the community to make sure that research is enhanced and that capacity building process is ongoing. That relationship building process took us, you know, every time when we do the process, we take about a year, and you can't take less than 6 months, I would say. In my opinion, when you're working with the community, you're going back and forth and at many levels. And that community will, you know, tell you who's next you have to talk to get this right. Not just the community champion, that's the first point of contact, but then you start, you know, is it the health director next it's the, you know, the community leadership, maybe chief and council. After that, who else is there? Like there's leadership experts, but there's also knowledge experts, there's knowledge holders in the community. There's all kinds of considerations we have to have when it comes to that community engagement part. And finally, we might have, let's say, a framework in mind about how we're going to do this, but as we're going there and we're talking about these, you know, how the design may look, we're also getting guidance about that and feedback around, yeah, that method might work and that other one may work, but perhaps this one may not. So this is what works and this is what may not work. And that community engagement process is critical for that. Margot, did you want to add anything on that?
No, that's good.
All right, so going to the next slide. I feel like I need a drink of water. I went through the must reads, the chapter 9 in the OCAP, but when it comes to, let's say, culturally specific protocols, here in Mi'kma'ki, or at least in Nova Scotia, we have the Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch. And any of the projects that we have been involved with, we go through various layers of ethics. So we would go through the institutional, Western-based approaches first, which means we would have to go through, let's say, the health center, and also the post-secondary institution that's, in this case, Dalhousie, and make sure that we also go back to the Mi'kmaq and say we're going through their process as well. So they make sure that we look at all the consideration when it has to do with respectful research from a Mi'kmaq perspective. Are we considering language, for example? Do we have to, should we have to, and we do, we've implemented questions, for example, that are written in Mi'kmaq and spoken in Mi'kmaq. We've also, their elder protocols and the recommendations that they have here in conducting research are implemented in that, and we have to go back and forth. It is a rewarding process if you get it right, and don't be afraid to get it wrong. That's where, you know, that's where it's important that people go back and forth and ask questions. The sense of accountability and establishing that sense of communication through that community engagement is critical. I can't express that any stronger, because then if we get it right as we go on, it only gets better and it only gets stronger and it only gets easier as we move forward. You know, almost 15 years later, Margot's been working with, you know, the communities here, and they know who she is. They know Margot's been working in their communities, and it's not just a community, like not a researcher in a colonial sense that comes in and scoops up information and leaves. That's, you know, that's critical that people know who the people are that are involved in this. And as the researcher myself, as an Indigenous person, and being Mi'kmaq and being of trust in the community, so I have a double sense of accountability here. So making sure that the research is accountable to both the institutional frameworks, but also to my community. And that's like my priority is that part, but then I have to make sure that we have a balanced approach when it comes to that. And that's where the two-eyed seeing part is incredible. And it helps us, you know, move forward in a, like a holistic way, not that word that I like, but a balanced way is what I want to get at. Can we see that video?
The Indigenous Health Research Advisory Committee, or IRAC, is a working group of the Chronic Pain Network. Our work is funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research under Canada's Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research. IRAC is comprised of community members, elders, patients, clinicians, and health researchers from across Canada. We are striving to facilitate authentic partnerships between Indigenous communities and researchers using a two-eyed seeing approach. A legacy of disrespectful treatment from external research teams has led to an atmosphere of caution, uncertainty, and distrust among many in the Indigenous population. As such, researchers wishing to include Indigenous participants in their studies have an ethical duty to build more inclusive partnerships with Indigenous communities. Research projects that are founded on a relationship that is reciprocal and trusting are more likely to be productive for all parties involved. Despite this, practical resources to guide communities and researchers through the logistics of the engagement process are limited, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach. IRAC was established to allow stakeholder groups to explore best practices in this area. The primary goal of this work is to facilitate the development of authentic partnerships and enhanced understanding between Indigenous communities and researchers. We intend to share the knowledge that we gather using this online resource, available to communities, researchers, policymakers, and the wider public. To find the resources to help you be a champion and collaborator in Indigenous health research, visit the website below.
So we'll go to the next slide. There's a couple of things that
So that's a link we can post to for people. But if you wanted to provide some feedback in the chat, again, if you found that helpful, or if it was clear what that resource is, that's sort of the first draft of it, and we're hoping that that'll be useful.
So I'll quickly, we have to speed up a little bit more. I noticed that there's a couple of questions on the side that we want to get to before we get going. We'll wait for the end. Capacity development, there's a two-eyed seeing perspective for capacity development. In this case is how we were looking at it and how we were trying to approach reciprocity in capacity development. A lot of folks even think that capacity development is a one linear way, that we're doing it from Western to the Indigenous, right? Like we're teaching the Indigenous people to do capacity or to learn about research, when it's a two-way street or multi-way street. Actually, we learn from Indigenous folks about doing research from a community-led process by, for example, in how we recruit researchers, even through, the community is able to vet who can do this type of research. And they're the ones that are showing us that, they can manage that process. And we just step back and we say, okay, how we normally would say we need masters or graduate students and people of multitude of experiences when it comes to doing research. Our communities are researchers by nature. We've been doing it for a long time. So we have to really trust that component when it comes to doing that process. And we've learned, for example, that the health centers have been collaborating extremely well when it comes to recruiting folks and bringing them on board. And the most important thing is that the folks that are doing research from the ground up, is incredible that they are taking part in this, because they feel like they're a part of the empowerment process of addressing a health issue in the community. And the vetting process by the community is not only because, we're not worried about them being paid or anything like that. It's not about the payment part. It's about the community accountability that makes sure that that person is taking pride in research, and that is their reward, which is more at stake than, let's say, the value of money. And a lot of folks don't understand that, because we're always stuck with the money part, and people are understanding that the researchers should be trained. There's all kinds of elements, and of course everybody likes money. But I'm just saying that the reward here is more gratifying from a cultural perspective, that you are taking part in addressing a health priority in the community. That's extremely important. Going on. Margot, I'm going to take a step back for a little bit and you go ahead for a second.
Sure. So I think we've already talked about the two-eyed seeing approach that was coined by Elder Albert Marshall and his wife Merdina. And this is the approach that we use for both the IRAC as well as the ACHH research. And it's really bringing together the two perspectives of Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge. And I think you could see some of that evidenced in the video. Next one. And so also John had alluded to data considerations, protection, and pathways. And so this information is embedded within the community protocols around ownership of the data, as well as contracts that would need to be signed with the community about where the data is stored, who has access to it, who's going to be using it once it's collected, who is able to share it, who's interpreting it. So there's all types of details embedded in that relationship building that you become aware of as part of that relationship building process, and that gets documented into a contract. And the image on the upper left-hand corner is the First Nations Information Governance Center, which also has information about how data is cared for. Next one.
I'll just chirp in there, using your word chirp. I just wanted to say that the data process and analyzing data was such an important process for us that, when we were looking at, for example, the art pieces of our data, we call it data, but then from a community perspective, it's sacred knowledge, and it's, it's spiritual. And And I had asked one of the data analysts that were looking at statistics for, the breakdown of the experiences of First Nations versus non-First Nations folks. I had asked the person, what do you see when you look at these numbers? And then the person said, I just see numbers. I said, and I said, do you not see people? And do you not see children? And they said, no. So that again, looking at it from a Western and Indigenous perspective, we had to understand that, the nature of this data is extremely important, that it's managed in a way that is respectful of the perspective we have, that we see this as stories, we see this as spiritual knowledge, we see this as sacred, not sacred as secular, but sacred as in, it's something representative of the lived experiences of the folks that are taking part in this process. It's just not another stat or another number. And then the other little piece about the data that was really meaningful as well, when we explained this to our, one of our partners was the Nova Scotia Art Gallery, and the art gallery was looking at the pieces, and they're so used to looking at art pieces and managing the art pieces in a careful way, because they're valuable and they have a historical value, for example. But when you explained that these art pieces were spiritual and that they were representative of lived experiences, then they also looked at it, not just the valuable, like the monetary value of this, they looked at it then and started treating it as a spiritual architect, information. And then, the curators were looking at it and very carefully moving it around, and they really put a lot of emphasis in securing that. That's extremely important. And that was how it captured to me when the curators were looking at the information and putting it together as art pieces. And that was extremely important and powerful as knowledge translation.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, could I just go back to that slide just for a moment? So this is just a visual representation. It's hard for people sometimes to grasp what we mean by engagement and re-engagement. But we tried to capture that with these circles and arrows. And just quickly to comment that our community engagement with all that map that John spoke of earlier that you saw, when we went to those communities, and for the communities that actually were able to participate in the ACHH projects, we met with elders, youth, and clinicians prior to actually doing any sessions or getting our ethics approval to make sure that what we were proposing, as John said, is a benefit to the community and fits within their priorities, and the way we're approaching it fits with their local protocols. And so just to give you a sense of that, and then we circle back at the end as well to help elders and youth and clinicians to help us interpret it so it's meaningful. Next slide. So this is the validation stage. This is Angela Navo and Rachel Bomberry. They are at the Des Droits de Disney Health Center in Hamilton. And Rachel is PhD nursing student at McMaster, and Ange is the manager there. And so they're fantastic. They worked step by step with us in this whole process in that community. And community can be, I mean, we talk about patient-oriented research, but with the work that we do, patient is actually community, and community can be urban, rural, remote. And this was an urban center that we worked with in Hamilton. And so the community gathered the knowledge. Ange and Rachel worked step by step, as I said, with us, and then helped us interpret it and validate that what we found was meaningful for that community. Next one. And then the last consideration is how we garden that data, how we've nurtured it along, and now we need to garden it and see what it produces, and then disseminate it and determine what is the benefit of those interpretations for different audiences. And so I think we're pretty strategic about the audiences that we engage. And so primarily, the first importance is the communities that we work with. How is this benefiting the community? And then discussing with the community, how do you want to share it? So then we share it with researchers. And we've learned, as you've learned today, as much about process as we have about outcomes with our research. It's sort of dual learning. And then we share it with clinical practice areas, but as you can see, we also share it with government leaders. And we're invited to Ottawa to keep it on their radar about the work that we're doing. And this is really important from an Indigenous health research perspective. Next slide. So next steps, ensuring respectful research practices to address Indigenous people's health, and thinking about how the research outcomes are sensitive to Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. We hope that we've shared some of that with you today as an example of what we've learned through our research and also the research process. Next.
We're at the 46:59 mark, 47, we're 2 minutes over time. Let's start going into question periods. And this is one of the questions we have as well to you. Do you feel you have some knowledge that can support your understanding of respectful research within Indigenous people, So let's open it up.
Does anyone have any specific questions for Margot and John? It's Dawn here. I think on behalf of everyone, I'd really like to thank both of you for taking the time today to share so many of these resources with the group. I know that we'll do our best to make sure too that we can share all of the links. We weren't able to share all of the video links, but we'll make sure that we do that. And a couple of the comments that we got from patient partners who are part of the Chronic Pain Network were about the fact that it would be really wonderful if Western-based research methods could learn more from Indigenous research ways and adopt that model. And there was an emphasis here specifically on the relationship building aspect that people really feel strongly about. So thank you, Margot and John. And if there are any questions, we're happy for you to come off mute. I think, Jacques, you've come off mute. Did you want to kick off the questions or comments?
That was not a question. It was a statement, and I was just going to say exactly what you just said. So the idea is that I think we've got lessons to learn here about respect. And not only with Indigenous people, but throughout the work that gets to be done. Thank you very much for your presentation. And Richard.
Hi, John. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I just wanted to comment. First of all, thank you both for the wonderful presentation. And, I've been probably close to 15 years doing research in Kahnawake on diabetes prevention, and have several publications, and of course one with John recently, looking at how researchers from a Western perspective and from an Indigenous perspective actually bonded together to do this research. And I just put up one on Basecamp that I did with 3 Indigenous colleagues from Kahnawake. And the focus then was on my research area is about relationship, but it's also about hermeneutics. Now, I know I've touched on this a few times and I won't go into it, but John and I started to have conversations about how philosophical hermeneutics from a Western perspective and two-eyed seeing actually worked quite well together. And we had many, many conversations about that. So I just wanted to share that the research that's being done, the problem is that when we have the bow tie model, or Margaret, the one you showed with the thing, is that we're not really dealing with how to develop that relationship when you have 2 really different groups of people coming together. And so Katie Burney and I have just submitted a paper looking at how to do that using adult learning methodologies and stuff like that. But one of them is also two-eyed seeing, because it's one of the most beautiful models that's not just applicable to Indigenous research and Western, but also for different groups of peoples like researchers and patient consultants. And I think, the beauty of all this is that Indigenous way of thinking about things is so relationally based, but we're missing it in other applications, because you can see it here, wonderful work. So I just wanted to thank you both, and just say that there's ways to transfer this wonderful way of thinking and bringing people together into other concepts, into other ways where people of different perspectives are trying to come together and make sense of each other. So I guess it's not a question, John. I guess it's more of a soapbox.
Mm. Richard, that's an important perspective. And we've seen this translate into various other areas, not just about pain and hurt and understanding research even, but using Tuait Seeing and or our experiences that we've seen into curriculum development, for example. We've seen the importance of clinical trainee and clinical approaches of looking at Tuait Seeing and implementing we need the two perspectives to address things such as racism in a clinical setting and or care settings. And that's been one of the things that since we've in fact been doing this since COVID started, is a lot of folks reaching out to us saying, how do we address the systemic challenges that people are facing in our Indigenous communities going to healthcare? What is respectful healthcare? How does it look? So, I went walking yesterday and I was going through Point Pleasant Park, and Elder Medina used to say, when you're going walking or you're going in the woods, you're always praying without the secular motion of praying, but understanding that you see things in a very spiritual way. And going back to the principle of working together, and that the trees are holding hands, is the approach, and understanding that we can't do it alone in this, this contemporary era. And Elder Albert, who I visited just a week and a half ago, had said, John, Tuait Seeing has existed since contact. It didn't, we just coined it in 1990, whatever, or 2003, or whatever the date he says, but it's been existing since we had contact pre-colonial time. And that enhancement of the perspectives had grown into a way of life for Mi'kmaq people to move forward with. And out of that comes Tuait Seeing. But we've had to really use the concept of peace and friendship to survive, survive with the other, the settlers, the Westerners, the whatever we want to use them as. And we can't do it alone. So in this contemporary era, we have to make sure that we hold hands together to move forward.
Thanks, John.
John and Margot, I just wanted to make just a comment about the last couple of years with the task force and some of the interactions I've had. I'm part of the CIHR Strategic Planning Committee as well. And just how much I've learned over the last couple of years about Indigenous health research and the model that the community model, and how much I've just found it so valuable. And I want to thank you both.
Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Linda.
Any other questions or comments? One thing I just wanted to comment on, John and Margot, you may be seeing there's all kinds of quotes from your presentation that people are putting into the comments. So even with all of our technological issues today, rest assured that people have really taken a lot from what you've said here. I think it's really struck a chord with people. One thing that, John, I just wanted to ask, we've got a couple of minutes. You had made a comment earlier when you first started talking about relationship building, and you said, don't be afraid to get it wrong. And, I think a lot of people are very worried potentially about getting into research that is collaborative with Indigenous communities because they are so afraid of getting it wrong. So I wonder if you could just expand on that a little bit and maybe give people a little bit of advice if this is an area that they're interested in.
It's like anything else. Our elders used the 7 sacred teachings, for example, and those 7 sacred teachings, we get to wisdom, which is the final stage. Elder Medina used to say, before we get to that wisdom stage, we have to have humility. So, you know, you have to have a sense of humility when it comes to doing communication. Humility will allow you to make those errors and own up to them. And as long as you do it in a respectful way and not cover it up and try to, you know, people are allowed to make errors. And I always say that even with the Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch, when we do presentations here, that research is about evolving, innovating, and growing. That's the part that the marshals always talk about, the gardening part. The gardening part is, it's not a perfect recipe. We need to make errors sometimes to make it better. And that those errors, as long as we know how to address them respectfully with the community, the leadership, and especially with the children that we, in this case, we're looking at, we have to try to mitigate as much of those processes in, let's say, gathering the data and using their knowledge, using our knowledge. That's why we have so many people guiding us along: the elders, the knowledge holders, the language experts, the leadership. Everybody is involved in that process so that we have a shared responsibility. And we may make an error here and there or skip a step. But as long as we know that we go back again and ask again, if we did this right, then, you know, we can move forward. And and you know what, we're not all experts here. We need to make sure that we address those processes as part of knowledge building, and don't be afraid to make those errors.
Can I just make a brief comment too? As researchers and academics, we're trained to be the ones as the principal investigator, as the lead author, as the lead on this. And we're trained to think that, you know, we own it, it's our own intellectual property. And all of that training has to be put aside. You really have to come to this as a learner and recognize that, just as John said, the humility piece is one of the sacred teachings, and you have to embody that to be able to do this research. So that's my small comment within that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Margot and John. Again, we really appreciate the time that you took today and all of what you've taught people. I know, again, from the comments that people have taken so much from this. And so we would like to let people know that this has been taped and it will go on to the Chronic Pain Network's YouTube channel. So, you know, you can go back there and watch it again. We'll make sure that all of the resources that are cited here can also be found in the description there for this video. And just a short reminder before we go that our next patient engagement in research webinar will be on December 9th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. It will include members from the Chronic Pain Network who are part of the Canadian Pain Task Force, and they'll be talking specifically about patient engagement in the Chronic Pain Task Force and how that has helped shape the work that the task force has done. So again, really big thank you to both of you, John and Margot, and to everyone who came today. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks so much.